Hi, Carlos. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me.
Hello, Izzy. I'm delighted to talk with you today, and I'm now in the island of Mallorca.
I got a very big heated response about my opinion about Seaspiracy.
In any case, it has really spurred a lot of debate. After many years, then the issues do occur. They are exaggerated and presented in a one-sided way. But I think it has raised this to the public debate. So it's a good time to then discuss how to move forward. So there's been a lot of discussions in the scientific community as well, in the NGOs, heated discussions, and it has really polarized a little bit the community. But my colleagues, which are actually the scientists that give statements on the film.
Yes. So, which were the scientists that you have a relationship with?
In fact, all of them. So Callum Roberts. So Callum Roberts is the one that gives more statements. Then Christina Hicks, and then Chris Landon, and then not a feature in the film, but they're using his work and his figures is somebody called Boris Worm. So then I watched the film, and I thought that my colleagues have given honest statements, but they, of course, were not in control of the messaging and the different tricks that were used in the film. None of them concurred with the key messages of the film. They all concur that there indeed still plenty of problems with some sectors of the fishing industry and how we source food from the ocean and even what we call sustainable fishing.
One of the things that the film came about with is that if we want to save the oceans, we should turn vegan. I mean, my problem with that sentence is, again, it's shifting the blame and the accountability to consumers when really, the decision making about oceans is from governments and corporations. They make the decisions about the oceans, they make about the food quality, about the plastic production, and to say people should turn vegan to save the oceans is a very big claim.
It's also very one-sided looking at consumers that have multiple options also from developed nations. So when I discuss the importance of food from oceans for our own health, mental health, and particularly female reproductive health, then they always claim, oh, but you can take supplements. But to dissociate the food into components, these are your supplements, and therefore you can now go vegan. First of all, it doesn't work. You cannot reduce it to just omega-3 or iodine, really the whole package that delivers the benefits, but also the food supplements are hugely expensive. So you're already promoting a sector of the industry which many of the people in developing nations depend on small fish as the main sources of micronutrients. So I think it really confounds the public debate. I think it's dangerous from a public health perspective also. Seafood is absolutely important for our health and mental health. And also, you say, deviates the blame from regulators, industry, and so on into the public, which is we don't live in a void. We can only consume the options that we are presented with.
Another claim that the film makes is that sustainable fishing doesn't exist. Does sustainable fishing exist?
So really the problem with this is that in fishery statistics or modeling, already in the 50s, there was a concept that arose that was called maximum sustainable yield. Mm-hmm. So the word sustainable there refers to the maximum yield. So that is what is the maximum harvest you can have without leading to the collapse of the fish. So that is a use of the term sustainable that was coined in the 1950s, and therefore it has an entirely different meaning and semantics for what the term sustainability conveys in the 21st century. So in the 21st century, sustainability has three main components, which is economic, and when you look at the collapse of your resource, you're really focusing on a partial view of the economic aspect of sustainability. But it also has components of the environment, and those are very broad components, and looking at unintended consequences in the broader ecosystem and so on. And then it also has a social dimension. So those three dimensions are not captured in the traditional meaning of maximum sustainable yield. But the problem with that definition, which also is the definition that the Oceana adopt in their web pages and materials, That definition comes from science, but the problem is that the term sustainability or sustainable does not carry the same meaning that we now attach to the word sustainability in the context of, for instance, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a little bit of play with semantics, but I think it's time for us to confront the semantics, dig the old term of sustainable from fisheries science, and then replace it with a common understanding of both the public and scientists and policymakers of what sustainability should be in the 21st century. So it is not true, as the film conveys, that there is no such a thing as sustainable fishing. And for instance, in Chile, a friend of mine, a collaborator of mine, Juan Carlos Castilla, developed decades ago a system. There is a participatory program with artisanal fishermen where the fishermen are given concessions by government, and they are allowed to manage that concession, and they manage it in as long as they are able to achieve as good outcomes for biodiversity and so on as they could achieve in a marine protected area. So the first thing, when you empower the fishermen themselves to take ownership of the resource, the first thing they do is they lower the catch, because they know that they are not catching sustainably. And the second thing that happens is that they regulate themselves to maintain the ecosystem healthy. And in fact, the experience in Chile shows that the outcomes in terms of biodiversity of these management areas that are given as concessions with conditions to fishermen are actually independently reporting better biodiversity status and also better social outcomes than the areas that are not regulated or even marine protected areas. But it has been far more difficult to implement that concept in industrial fisheries, particularly in fisheries that is conducted in the high seas, where regulatory elements are largely missing.
When we see these images of these huge ships with massive nets trawling the ocean, capturing so many fish, and along with that sometimes there is the shark or dolphin, what do we say to that? You know, that doesn't look like it could be sustainable in any way. And
yeah, well, that image certainly is not sustainable, and indeed trawling itself is really a very negative activity for the environment, and trawling destroys submarine habitats in the seafloor. Trawling can potentially emit carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at rates equivalent to the whole aviation sector. Much of the deep sea corals that were not known until a few decades ago had been destroyed by trawling before they were discovered.
Seldom regulated, right? If it's happening in the open waters, then
I think it is revealing that the last pending issues in the Brexit were all about fisheries, right? The whole concept of the economic exclusive zone is inspired by efforts to be able to govern fisheries resources. The UK has taken unprecedented steps to protect areas. Right now, they're seriously looking at the future of trawling, because I think it's well understood and known that trawling is certainly not a sustainable activity for any of the three dimensions that we discussed, because it's really destructive to the environment. So we need to replace current practices and fishing gear by fishing gear that can be compatible with the concept of sustainability and also is free from damages to habitats in the environment, but also by catch, which is what you refer to as a main source of mortality of marine animals. But there's fishing gear that can be selective and avoid largely this bycatch.
If we were to, for example, employ in the whole world the same model as in Chile, so give the power to the fishermen without these huge nets, would they be able to fish enough fish for the population or for the demand?
Yes, I believe so, if we are clever and wise about that. Also, I think an important element is to understand that the type of fisheries that is reported in Seaspiracy is not the average fishery, and they do not reflect the small artisanal fishery. They, for instance, do not capture fishery models in Japan, where the fishermen, they see it as part of their job, not only to harvest marine life from the environment, but to dedicate on average 2 to 3 days of their work per day to enhance the marine habitat so it remains productive. So you can go around the world and see many examples of artisanal fisheries that is truly sustainable, is place-based, and generates value and benefits to communities, but those are not portrayed at all by Seaspiracy. So much of the fisheries around the world is not the large-scale industrial fisheries, but there's been a competition between industrial fishing and artisanal fisheries. We can focus in Somalia, for instance. Then industrial fisheries have come to deplete the fish stocks that artisanal fishers from Somalia could access from shore, until the nets started to come up empty because there were big vessels offshore collecting all the fish. So the outcome of that was piracy. Most of the piracy activity is actually a consequence of industrial fishing co-opting the resources upon which the local people depend. So you can see also that overfishing and irresponsible industrial fisheries is also often closely linked to illegal activities in many areas. For instance, Mexico, even northwest Spain, in many areas, there's somewhere connections between illegal fishing and other illegal activities. And then some problems are reported in Seaspiracy, like forced labor at sea, and also child employment at sea. Those are real problems that are problems of a sector of the fishing industry that have taken a free-riding behavior without consideration for either of the three components, and just looking at the one which is economy and making a lot of money without respect for the other two dimensions.
There's another big fact that's thrown in there, that 50% of the plastic that we find in the ocean is discarded fishing nets and these ghost nets.
It's also wrong. It's not scientifically accurate. Fishing gear discarded is a significant contributor to marine plastic pollution. So plastics can be found in objects of very different sizes, from microscopic to very large. So some of the very large objects that you can find at sea, and that's where the 50% may come from. Below, microplastics are a small fraction of the total load of plastics. So the total load of plastic, the contribution from fishing activities or at sea activities might be about 20%. So much still comes from land-based sources, or also objects that are unrelated to fishing. Again, distort a bit the facts in a way that mislead the audience. But also one aspect that I meant to discuss, which is important, is aquaculture. So in my opinion, in a hopeful future, we no longer harvest large marine animals from wild populations, but we grow our food in controlled, sustainable systems. Aquaculture is also depicted as a destructive industry in the film. That is, again, also very one-sided and distorted. And yes, there's been quite a few examples of aquaculture that have caused problems in the environment.
When you say agriculture, you mean fish farming?
Yeah, fish farming.
Right. For example, I stopped eating salmon maybe about 10 years ago, when I realized that most of the salmon we eat is farmed, and they're fed these hormonal pellets and they're eating each other, and salmon in nature needs to swim. I would rather not touch fish that are farmed.
Let's talk about food production from the ocean, not just fish, right? So we call it fisheries, but fisheries include all kinds of animals and plants, many other species. So right now, in fact, fish production from aquaculture is maybe 30% or 20% of the total output. About 70 to 80% of aquaculture production is not fish. 50% of that is seaweed. And seaweed farming not only does not cause problems in the environment, but it's actually a source of benefits. It helps with carbon sequestration, but also alleviates ocean acidification and deoxygenation, because the plants inject oxygen in the water as they grow, and also supports biodiversity because it provides habitat. So there is really nothing that prevents aquaculture from being sustainable, even a regenerative force in the environment. When it comes to fish, then we probably need to lower trophic level of the fish. So every level you go up on that food pyramid or food web, then you lose about 90% of the food because of the reduced efficiencies. In marine food webs, there is also a process called biomagnification, by which the pollutants are accumulated upwards in the food web. So that's why tuna and apical predators tend to have high levels of mercury and other pollutants. So you should eat them with caution, like not bait. But if you harvest and eat and consume the marine food web at a low level, then that becomes safer and more sustainable. And it is possible also to even grow salmon sustainably by developing a circular economy in aquaculture, where you use seaweed and organisms to create the food for the salmon, and you also grow them in ethically acceptable conditions where the fish have ample spaces to move. But of course, it cannot be that most of aquaculture is fish production, because that would not be sustainable. And in the long term, the future of aquaculture is on multi-trophic aquaculture, which is what we call integrated aquaculture, where you grow an ecosystem where you have seaweed, filter feeders like mussels, and then you have some crustaceans. You have like a little ecosystem, and then you harvest the production of that ecosystem. But most of that production is going to be on photosynthetic organisms like seaweed or herbivores, not carnivores.
So in what way was what they said, how was it twisted or distorted?
No, what they said wasn't twisted. So they stand by their statements. They have no problem with the statements that are captured. The whole narrative of the film and the way in which their statements are embedded, right? So their statements are not standalone.
So the context.
So they would not agree with the message of the film and the context, and also the fact that it exaggerates the problems. I think that all of the problems that are portrayed are real, and they do exist somewhere, but they do not represent the reality of food production from the oceans. They have chosen to portray a particular examples of negative behaviors and negative industries, negative components of the industry, but that is not a balanced portrayal of the way we produce food and harvest food from the ocean. None of them agreed with the message that we should not eat fish or eat seafood, and that there is not such a thing as sustainable fishing. But I think that all of them see value, and I do see value on the conversation, the opportunity to have a conversation.
Right? I have a question actually from one of our drivers. I don't know if you remember Katie Munnings. She actually came second in the race last week. So
congratulations to her.
She asks, what can we do individually? Is it best to stop eating fish entirely? I always looked for the MCS label, but is that enough?
Well, I think the MCS label is a place to start, but is, as we discussed earlier, is not fully encompassing of a 21st century concept of sustainability. That need to look at other components like social justice and social equity in the way this fisheries is conducted, and all of the people and labor that participates in eventually deliver that fish to your market. That is part of that social component of sustainability that is not assessed by MSC, and also the broader impacts on the environment are not assessed either. So we probably need MSC and other accredited agencies to also step beyond the narrow definition of sustainable fisheries, and then adopt a more comprehensive concept of sustainability today, so that when citizens do search for the label, they have confidence that that label is consistent with the way they understand the concept of sustainability, which is certainly not the narrow understanding that the fisheries is sustainable if you can continue to harvest without it collapsing. That's a very narrow definition, but that's the definition that eventually makes it. But we need to challenge that and have a more comprehensive understanding. So the best policy could have today, rather than looking for the label, is to as a citizen, demand that the issue of sustainability in food production from the ocean is addressed, and that a fully encompassing concept of sustainability is adopted for sourcing food from the ocean, but also from land. I think we have similar problems from land, and we are not talking only about animal sources of food, but also land sources of food, because pesticides, herbicides, and many of these chemicals do really have devastating impacts on the environment. For instance, this is the first spring that I'm in a spring, because in Saudi Arabia we don't really have a spring, But I mean, now in Mallorca, I really noticed that there are very few butterflies compared to a long time ago. We're seeing a collapse of many insects under chemicals that are used for agriculture. And not only the insects themselves, but we ourselves accumulate those compounds. So I think the concept of sustainability with all the three axes need to be embedded in every aspect of how we source our food, regardless of what form of food is it, whether it is fish or seafood or vegetables or meat.
Would you recommend going to local fishmonger rather than buying fish from a supermarket where it's...
Yeah, well, obviously, if you buy from your local fisherman, then you are also buying locally, and you have a much better opportunity to have an understanding of how that fish is sourced, how it is treated, because there's also concepts of embedding concepts of animal ethics and fair treatment of the animals in fisheries. And that is not just a matter of the ethical aspect alone, but it has also been shown that the stress that the animals experience, it actually releases stress compounds that affect the quality of the products. Right, yeah. So I think if you are sourcing your food from a proximal source, you have a much better likelihood to be able to assess those components yourself and also to have some understanding of what is the health of the local environment. But I will certainly not detach ourselves from the marine food web, because as I emphasize, that is absolutely vital for our mental health and also for reproductive health, particularly for women. So please do not give up food from oceans, and you can take it in the form of seaweed or take it in the form of bivalves or oysters or shrimp or any other, but do continue to eat healthy seafood. The most important element of Seaspiracy is that if the film had been produced, we would not be having this conversation. Yeah. So I think it has really allowed for this to surface, which was much needed, because there's a real need to update the definition of what sustainability is in terms of food production, and not just promotions, but across the board, and have much better informed citizens that can exert their rights and powers as citizens to demand that their food is sourced in a sustainable manner and also is healthy to us and to the environment.
So then, thank you, Seaspiracy, for starting the conversation.
Yes. What I'm doing with my colleagues, which are these 4 that are featured in the film, is that we have written a piece, not a review of the film, not about the tricks that they used or what do they portray and what they don't, because it's really a one-sided advocacy piece, but really about the broader conversation that we need to have about how to move forward with a more encompassing definition of sustainable fishing, and also making a very clear point that I was making when we were discussing on board Santa Elena. Consuming seafood is extremely important for people to maintain our health, and we have been always part of the marine food web, because from the oldest dwellings of modern humans, that consumption of seafood and the link between food promotions and humans has been fundamental for our brain health and our reproductive health, and really very important in our evolution and even our current health. So we make that clear, make no mistake, our connection to the ocean as a source of food is very important for our health, and it's a natural one because it has always been there.